Thank you very much for the BIC for organizing this this talk, and thank you all for coming on a very rainy day. And I hope I will not disappoint you. There is something new that I would like to talk about. Today I'll be talking about the indigenous education in India, the indigenous schools. These are not colonial schools, these are indigenous schools that existed. I will talk a little about the Sanskrit schools, and I will also talk largely about the indigenous vernacular schools, Marathi, Tamil, Telugu, Bengali, and so on and so forth. And the area I'll be covering is only British India, which is in pink color, and the green area is, the princely states. We had 500 plus princely states, so we do not have data on these areas. So I'll be talking only about the British India. What do we know about the indigenous education? Many people have written, and there are various kinds of imaginations, and most widely understood imagination, or rather something that is there out in the public domain, is that it was oral. All transmission of knowledge in the Hindu tradition was oral, and it was controlled by the Brahmins, the one section of the society. And it was conducted, they were informal schools. It was conducted under trees, and teachers were members of the village community and received remuneration in kind, like potters and other the occupational castes. And it was destroyed by the British. My fundamental question is, India has produced 500 texts, 1 lakh inscriptions, and 12 widely used script, and how can an oral tradition create this? It's a myth that came into existence during freedom movement. It was a myth was created for a particular reason. So that has become fact. Sometimes politicians talk about certain myths, and then that becomes the fact. But what exactly was in oral tradition? Only 4 Vedas were taught in oral tradition. The rest of 496 texts were used. The manuscripts, the palm leaf manuscripts, were used for teaching these texts. So when you compare that, the written tradition was predominant and not the oral tradition. Even when the boys, particularly, when the boys studied Vedas, they were already proficient in Sanskrit language as well as literature. They knew the literacy, they already had the literacy. So when was the data collected? It was not collected by colonial state per se. It was collected by a bunch of liberal British officers, and most of them were Scots. Okay, why did they collect it? They specially collected, for example, in 1813 renewal of the Charter Act, 1 lakh rupees was earmarked by the British Parliament, but colonial state did not want to use it. Using that money to encourage or discourage or whatever the indigenous education, they thought it is a way of interfering in the internal affairs of the Hindu society, which they did not want to do. So these liberals, they wanted the colonial state to use this money for education, and their argument was essentially, firstly, and they had witnessed, for example, Charles Grant and others had witnessed the massive Bengal famine of 1768, where 10 million people died. Now there is a difference of opinion among the historians. Some say 2 million, some say 5 million, some say 10 million. But the exact numbers we do not know, but the largest, the number is about 10 million. So they said that the education is best defense against natural calamities. So an educated peasant will be able to defend his interest, and the whole list they give, he'll be able to, instead of cultivating rice, he will be, which is water intensive, he'll be able to cultivate, fruits, and he'll be able to export the fruits, and so on and so forth. The whole list of reasons they give. The second reason was that it will stop superstitious practices like sati, in female infanticide, and finally, they wanted to give a say in the administration, Indians a say in the administration. So this is why the data was collected. In fact, most of the data was collected by the Scots, whether it is Thomas Munro as a governor of Madras Presidency, or William Adam as a friend of Ram Mohan Roy, who went around collecting the data. They were all Scots. So we have data of 16,000 indigenous schools, and we have data of several districts which cannot be tabulated. For example, one Bellary in North Konkan, he says 380 boys are there in Thana, in all schools in Thana. They come equally from Brahmin, Prabhu, Sutar, Bhandari, and even coolies. Brahmins and, like Prabhu, the upper caste non-Brahmin. Sutar is a carpenter. And Bhandari is a toddy tapper. So that means the lowest of the OBC students were also there, and even the coolies. So without complete information, it is difficult to tabulate the data. So the earliest data, this is a very fascinating data. British conquered Western India in 1818. And they sent out Thomas Best Jervis, who was a statistician, and who was also proficient in Marathi. Thomas Best Jervis and his brother George Jervis, they were born in India. And they were very proficient in the language because he wanted to translate algebra into Marathi. But he died early, and his older brother George Jervis translated it. The first Marathi textbook on algebra called Bijaganit was done by his older brother. So he went. He was basically sent to collect the information about the number of villages, number of roads, rivers, basically to tax the population. But he was interested in education. He went and sat in every school, and he collected the data. So we know the name of every teacher, every Marathi teacher in the district because of Jervis' interest. And he was also the first to establish a teacher training institution in Ratnagiri district in 1820. So, So this is the data. So we have 33 Brahmin teachers, 40 upper caste non-Brahmin teachers, and 9 artisanal, from artisanal caste, what we today call OBC. And out of 82 Hindu teachers, this is the list. And then we have 2 Muslim and 2 Jewish. These are Marathi schools. These are not madrasas. The Muslim teachers are teaching the Marathi schools. So this is the data we have. And does it mean to say that these 33 Brahmin teachers were teaching these 567 Brahmin students? It was not the case. So 2 examples I have given mainly because I don't have time to talk about all the 82 schools. In village Pant, Bajipant Marathe is a Brahmin teacher. He taught 1 Brahmin, 6 Sonar, 1 Shimpi, 10 Bhandari, 4 Sali, 3 Mali, 6 Khatri, and 1 Marathi Khatris are OBCs. They are not upper caste. So 1 Panchal Bai in a shed that belonged to a Teli. We have another village, Pali, Amrutrao Bhagwant. He's a Prabhu. He taught 5 Brahmin, 6 Prabhu, 7 Sonar, 5 Kasar. Kasar is coppersmith. 4 Maratha, 5 Shimpi. You see the list of students, and this was an inclusive classroom. And, were these inclusive classrooms limited to Ratnagiri district? No, they were not. So I have given 2 examples of, Gujarati speaking and Kannada speaking, districts. You look at the statistics. The majority of students in these 4 districts were non-Brahmins. In fact, Veeragram with 140 villages does not even have a single Brahmin student. Was it limited to only Western India, Bombay Presidency? No. Look at the data for teachers in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This is both, Bengali speaking and Hindi speaking. In South Bihar, which consisted of about 7-8 districts, like South Bihar has been divided into 7-8 districts now. There is not a single Brahmin teacher. Just remember this fact when I go to the next slide, which is about the students. And see the number of Dalit teachers. Their numbers are very few, but still that, you find the Dalit teachers there. So the majority of the teachers and students, 256 Brahmin students in South Bihar were studying under non-Brahmin teachers. Out of 24,318, you find only 5,744 Brahmin students. So predominant, and this is a fact because they are the majority, the non-Brahmins are the majority. So obviously in any school, in any part of India, they would be, they would be there in large numbers. Now, 1,470 teachers, we find Kayasthas 1019, Brahmin 208, artisanal caste 118, Dalit 17. And again, William Adam, who collected data. William Adam was a Sanskrit scholar, and he also knew Bengali very well. So he collected the data. He says parents of good caste do not hesitate to send their children to schools conducted by teachers of an inferior caste or even of a different religion. It is true of Chandal and other low caste teachers enumerated. In one particular village, village Uppar Bazar in Nator, Rajshahi district, Nabakishore Das, he is a Dalit, he was teaching in a school established by Govindapal, who was an upper caste Mahajan, in a Chandi Mandap where the worship was taking place. The priest was a Brahmin, obviously, so the worship was taking place. So the kind of the caste animosity that we see, it comes towards the end, towards the end of 19th century. This is the caste-wise list of students in indigenous schools and missionary schools. When the missionary schools were established, they do not move to the missionary school. They continue to remain in the indigenous schools. Does it means to say that there was no discrimination? We do not know, but at least it is not recorded. Because William Adam went and sat in the classrooms and observed teaching, we do not. He has written, and many others also have written, that they sat on separate mats. But except that, we do not find any kind of discrimination. So now let us come to the Madras Presidency. We have data of 11,000 schools. So the largest chunk of schools data we get here, 11,619. These are all single teacher schools. All the schools that I talked today, they are all of single teacher schools. We have 30,479 Brahmin, the Vaishya, Shudra, all other castes. This is a very interesting thing. These are not Shudras, they are lower than the Shudras. Then who are they? We can safely say that they are Dalits and other castes which, the definition is little difficult. For example, shepherds, where do you put today in they come under OBC, but many a time they lived on the margins of the society. So they also probably belong to this. So we have, out of 1,42,369 Hindu students, we have 1,11,890 non-Brahmin students. So this is, the district-wise data of the indigenous schools. I have highlighted in purple Bellary and Srirangapatnam because they are Kannada-speaking areas. I thought you might be interested in knowing what was happening in these two, districts. See the data. This covers, Telugu, Tamil, Malayalam, and Kannada-speaking areas, and certain Odia schools. Yeah.
The data from previous slide. So when we assume indigenous schools are the only source of information for children, or were there other schools?
There were missionary schools. Government had not started establishing schools at this point of time. This is 1823 data.
Because I see a good number of Shudra people, but the Brahmins and Vaishya numbers are kind of reducing. I was just wanting to understand. Is this the place where they started coming in as first-gen learners to school?
No, these are not the students who are going to missionary schools. Because most of the missionary school children were from the lowest of the caste, the Dalits and others. They were the ones who were going there. Okay. So in Northwestern Province, only 8 districts were under the British control. And these were Agra, Aligarh, Bareilly, Etawah, Farrukhabad, Mainpuri, and Mathura, because rest of area was controlled by the Mughal emperor who was still on the throne, and eastern UP was controlled by Nawab of Awadh, and even in the rest of the area, in between area, there were small Nawabs like Nawab of Rampur and others. So what was exactly under the British control was 50 towns and 14,987 villages. So we have these number of schools that exist there. We have 27,853 boys. And there were no schools in 12,987 villages. So among the Hindu teachers, 46.4 were Kayasthas, 43% 9 Brahmins, and this is the only area where you find large number of Brahmin teachers. UP and Telugu speaking area, Andhra Pradesh, that's coastal Andhra, which was under the British administration, and also parts of Gujarat. These are the 3 areas where you find large number of Brahmin teachers. So this is Out of 21,342 Hindu students, 6,614 were Brahmins, 10,429 non-Brahmin upper caste, and 4,299 lower caste boys. Other schools. Because of the lack of time, I'm not discussing too much about girls' schools. There were no separate girls' schools in South India. Girls went to the same school where the boys were taught. So in a way, they were co-educational schools. In Punjab, there were women teachers and girls' schools. Except these two areas, you do not find girls in any school in any other part of India, either in Bombay Presidency or Bengal. Now, coming to the Sanskrit school, this is very interesting. We find, two kinds of schools in Bengal, that is, they were together called tolls, that is, the schools that taught grammar and Sanskrit language and some, the subjects that were exclusive, something like Vedas or, Nyaya or Dharmashastra or any of these, But rest of India, the same teacher taught language, grammar, and one of the, the disciplines there. So that is the difference between the two, and then there were considerable number of non-Brahmin Sanskrit teachers in Bengal, North India, Kerala, and most of them belong to Baidya, Kayastha, Ahir, and several Shudra castes. Rest of India, that is, the Tamil-speaking areas and Marathi-speaking areas, all teachers of Sanskrit were Brahmins. So this is an interesting data we have for Kerala. This is the northern part of Kerala, which was under the British administration. Look at the number of boys and girls. Even girls are there in Sanskrit schools. Only Vedas, only Brahmin boys and girls. Jyotishya, Shudra boys, Shudra girls, all other caste boys, 490. They are the maximum number of students in these, schools that taught Jyotishya. Nyaya, Ayurveda. Ayurveda, you even find 4 Muslim students studying Ayurveda. Metaphysics, when the enumerators talk about metaphysics, I really do not know. I think it could be philosophy. That's why I have put a question mark. Now, the number of Sanskrit, tolls and pathshalas, we generally assume, places like Tanjavur, which was a sacred city, it must have had large number of Sanskrit schools. But interestingly, it is Rajahmundry which had the largest number of schools. Something that we do not expect it. And Bardhaman was next, and Coimbatore was, comes later. So this also gives us an interesting data.
One question.
Yeah.
Was Sanskrit taught as a separate language in these schools?
No, I'm talking about 2 separate kinds of schools, indigenous vernacular schools and Sanskrit school.
Vernacular Sanskrit was not taught at all as a subject.
No, not Sanskrit was not taught as a subject, but Amarakosha was taught, which is, half of Amarakosha is Sanskrit.
Yeah.
Okay, so that way the students had the link from their language to Sanskrit, but Sanskrit exclusively was not taught. So what do we see in All India pattern in vernacular schools? These are Tamil, Marathi, Gujarati, Kannada, and Malayalam schools. 70 to 75% non-Brahmin students and teachers, more than 35% were from artisanal caste, or what we today call OBC caste. Majority of teachers came from Kayastha, Baidya, Lingayat, and Pillai caste. Most of the teachers in Tamil-speaking area, they come from Pillai caste. Andhra and Gujarat were, where majority of teachers were Brahmins, and Brahmin students studying under non-Brahmin teacher was common. There was no such ban on anything, And schools were conducted in temples, sheds, and houses of rich persons, and there was no dedicated building, and they were not certainly conducted under trees. I'll just tell you why. The average number per school normally varied between 8 to 25. There was a school in Konkan, that is Ratnagiri district, which had only 2 students, and there was a large, school in Kaira district in Gujarat, which had 150 students, and it was managed by brothers. So, now school timings. These were not informal school. Whenever the teacher called, they would go and, listen to some stories. No, they functioned 12 hours a day. The school would start at 6 or 7 a.m. in the morning, depending on the sunrise, and would work till 9 or 10 a.m. And again, they had a second session, 1 hour break and second session, and again a 1 hour break and a third session. And they functioned on the basis of lunar, month of 30 days. And schools had holidays on full moon, new moon, Ekadashi, Dwadashi, as well as all important festivals. Now, what was the curriculum? This is where I found extremely interesting, because India was politically fragmented in the early part of 19th century, late 18th century onwards. But all vernacular schools, whether you take Hindi, the northernmost part of Bihar, to the southernmost part of India, that is Malayalam schools, you find vernacular translation of Ramayana and Mahabharata. And Amarakosha was taught, Panchatantra was taught, and Hitopadesha was also taught. So there was no break between the Sanskrit knowledge and the regional knowledge. For example, in Karnataka, where the schools which taught Someshwara Shataka also taught Panchatantra and Hitopadesha. So, the Kannada literature was also linked to that existed in Sanskrit, Sanskrit literature. In Madras, the Tirukural was, commonly taught across the board, across all the schools. Letters and petitions of locality, letter writing was taught. Arithmetic up to long division, to cast up accounts, and to draw out bills of exchange. This is not just addition and subtraction. It's much higher than this. Village accounts were taught. So all schools taught composition, grammar, literature, arithmetic, and so on. The most interesting thing is writing petitions. If you go to any archives, you will find thousands of petitions written by Indians. Each year, petitions are filed. The files are this big. Like 1,200 pages or 1,400 pages. And they complain, they talk, they thank, the local administration, and they are extremely, they give complete information. So most of the petitions that I looked at it, belong to the schools. We have, for example, there is a very interesting petition, one of the oldest petition that I came across. British conquer Western India in 1818, and 1820 there is a petition, September 5th it was written by Syed Badruddin Panwalkar and Balaji Krishna Kulkarni, and they say that they have already an English medium school, and the teacher is of Maratha caste, and we have so many students and they belong to these castes, and they request Elphinstone, the governor of Bombay Presidency, to give salary to this teacher. They say that we are not able to give salary. Why they are not able to give salary? The reason is that it is an agrarian economy. You get income only end of the year when the harvesting season happens. So they cannot give monthly salary to the teacher. So they request the government. So all these petitions contain enormous amount of information, and one can write history on that. So the father's punishment was very severe. In fact, all the people who collected the data request the government to stop this amount of punishment. Punishment was very severe. It also shows that the schools were not casual, because parents would monitor. The mothers who would not go to school actually catch hold of the teacher on the many. There are many autobiographies written by the people who went to these indigenous schools. Lal Bihari Day is one person. He's written a biography, and he says that when my father went to the school and inquired, it was okay. But the day my mother met the teacher, and the teacher said that he's not doing well, that day I would get a thrashing that I dreaded that day, he says. So even mothers were invested in children's education. Children began school at between 5 and 6 years and completed by the time they were 13, 14. Nobody failed. This is one of the fantastic features of the indigenous school, is that nobody failed. Bright children took about 4 years, average children took about 6 years, and below average children took about 8 years to complete the course of instruction. Writing was taught on the very first day. They used sandboards. Sandboards are an amount of sand which was put in front of every child, and the child would start tracing the alphabet and write small words. In fact, this was actually told to me by my father in his village in Anantapur district. He said that there was a Hanuman temple, and they would put an amount of sand in front of them, and the teacher is a Muslim teacher who would come to teach Telugu, English, and basic science, maths and basic science, and he would show us how to draw on the sand and then write short words. And once they progressed to the sentences, once the children started writing the sentences, then they would go to wooden boards. And when my father told me this story long back, and I asked him one simple question, Anantapur is not on the coastal region, how did you get the sand? He said, we got the sand from the riverbed. Okay, so that's how. And the wooden boards were, the calico cloth was dipped in rice starch several times, and finally it was dipped in charcoal solution, and it was fixed to a board. Roughly it was about 1.5 feet to 2 feet, 1.5 feet width and 2 feet length, and the boys carried. And they used this is a sample manuscript I am showing. This was not a textbook in the classroom. This manuscript is in UTC archives in Bangalore. So just to give an idea of what kind of palm leaf manuscripts were used. So soapstone sticks were used. They were called batti in North India and balapai in South India. I don't know what they were called in Tamil and Malayalam, but they were used for writing on the boards. Income of the teacher. Teachers got anywhere between 1 rupee to 8 rupees. The lowest was in Talwandi district, which the teacher got 1 rupee, 2 annas. They paid anywhere between 1 to 8 annas. I hope all of you are familiar with rupee anna paisa. At least you must have heard about it. So Bihar, again, it was one of the lower side, 1 rupee, 12 anna and 9 paisa a month. Bengal, it was 3 rupees, 12 annas. Bombay, it was 6 rupees. Lahore and Kasur, 7, 8 rupees. Gujarat is interesting. The teachers did not get monthly fee. Every time a child completed an amount of learning, for example, if the child completed alphabets, the teacher would get 2 rupees. Once the child completed writing 1 to 100, the teacher would get 2 rupees. So this was a system that they followed, and they also got some gifts during Diwali, marriage, and some local produce. This was not in lieu of cash. Cash transaction was very different, and the gifts, occasional gifts, were very different. Sorry. So what happened to indigenous schools during the British period? I'll just give a quick run through the number of colleges that they established. They all, were either Sanskrit colleges or Arabic colleges. Okay, so the first 10 educational institutions that the British established were, either Arabic or Sanskrit colleges. But there was a lot of protest by Indians. The Indians said that we already have this knowledge, but what we want is modern knowledge. So after 1825, they stopped it because there was a massive protest by Indians. So what they did was that from 1840 onwards, they followed a policy of incorporation. By 1840, they had complete information about the indigenous schools which was under the British administration. So they started talking about setting up a national system of education for the entire country based on foundations of indigenous schools. So they adopted the school, gave 1 month teacher training, basically to maintain attendance register, prepare quarterly and annual reports, use maps and globes, etc. for teaching geography. They continued the indigenous curriculum. So there is a slight tweaking of the indigenous curriculum. For example, in Kannada schools, the indigenous schools used Shabdamani Darpana, which was the grammar book. But what the colonial administration did was that it split the Shabdamani Darpana. It brought out an abridged version for primary schools, and it used the actual text Shabdamani Darpana for high school. So that kind of tweaking did happen, but nonetheless, it was entirely based on the indigenous curriculum. They added history of India and geography, and also supplied maps, globes, blackboards, and books for the students. And by the end of 19th century, all these indigenous schools got school buildings, but not in the beginning. So they gave 5 rupees a month as a salary and pension after completing 20 years of service. So the reasons of incorporation, there are 2. First, indigenous schools gave very high quality of literacy and numeracy for the students. Boys joining high schools could master algebra and geometry. This has come from all British officers from across India. My forthcoming book, Routledge Companion to History of Education, I have discussed extensively. In fact, one full chapter I discuss the competency of Indian students, how competent they were. So the quality of education given in indigenous schools were good, so that was the reason why they adopted. The second reason was financial. Macaulay had fixed the salaries of Indian teachers at 30 rupees and government was not ready to give that amount. So new schools means cost of new buildings, maintenance and high salary. So what they did was that they adopted the schools and introduced history. And history gave a sense of India's grand past to the students, and geography actually helped India to form itself into the nation, linking the village to the district and district to the province and to the larger idea of India. Punjab and Bombay were the only two areas where the British established new schools. Punjab, they introduced Urdu because there was a lot of conflict between Punjabi Gurumukhi schools, or the people who were using Punjabi and Gurumukhi, and Punjabi and Hindi. The Hindus and Sikhs, there was a lot of, I wouldn't use the word conflict, but then there was a lot of, it's difficult to use terms now, like so much of identity politics is there now. So there was, conflict of interest between the two. So finally the British decided, okay, neither your language nor their language, let's introduce Urdu as a medium of instruction, which was also resisted. That is how you see lot of Arya Samaj schools that come up by the end of 19th century, by 1870s onwards. And you also find Singh Sabha schools coming up for the Sikh children and so on. So that was one reason. But the worst educational policy was in Bombay. Bombay, Elphinstone rejected even the poor Brahmins as teachers. In fact, I have written extensively in my book, how the first batch of teachers were, selected, and they were all poor Brahmins. And he was so angry, and she shouted at the chief secretary and saying that, why have you brought these beggarly Brahmins? And they were sent back. So he personally selected landed Brahmins as teachers. So as a result, and this is the kind of Brahmin teachers that you come across in Phule's writings, who would not let the lower caste children to, get into schools. See, this is, we have just seen the Ratnagiri district data. 179 Prabhu students out of 218 upper caste students in 1820. And 1842, the number of Prabhus came down to 6, single digit. In 1820, 393 students from artisanal caste consisted of 92 Sonar, 72 Kasar and 44 Shimpi. Their numbers came down to 6, 7 and 5 in 1842. Within 22 years, the number of non-Brahmin and lower caste children come down considerably. The other artisanal caste, Mali, Teli, Sutar, Dhangar, they simply disappear from the list of students. This is also one of the reasons why there is such a rigorous non-Brahmin movement in Maharashtra. So after they started incorporating the indigenous schools, they categorized the indigenous schools into 4 categories. The stipendary pathshalas, where they gave 5 rupees salary and pension to the teachers. Rewarded pathshalas, for example, many of the schools, indigenous schools that were in remote areas, they did not have access to teaching aid, but they were already getting 8 rupees. So they did not want to forego that. So they just told the colonial state that we want teaching aid. So they supplied teaching aid, and they were called rewarded pathshalas. Then the registered pathshalas, for example, an indigenous school near Madras or near Bombay, they were already getting higher income, and they were also able to go just into the city and then buy whatever they wanted. So they refused to take any government aid, but then the government gave 1 rupee for submitting the data, because regularly, almost on an annual basis, the British members of parliament, they were questioning the colonial state about what it had done for education of Indians. So they wanted statistics. So finally, we have indigenous pathshalas with no connection to the government. They refuse the salary because they were already earning more, and they did not want to change also. So we have 4 categories. So during Hunter Commission, the first time we come across all India data, this for the British India, we have 84,740 primary schools with 21,54,311 children. Of them, only 5,360 were established by the British. Almost 70,000 government primary schools were indigenous schools adopted by the, by the government. So you understand the enormous number of schools that the British adopted. So first they were called, they were known as indigenous schools, then they were called circle schools because they started adopting one by one school in a circle. So they were called circle schools, then halkabandi, which also means harkal in Urdu, village schools, pathshalas up to 1860. From 1860 onwards, they introduced 1% cess, education cess. So they came to be called, cess schools. This education cess worked this way. If a peasant was paying 100 rupees, revenue to the government, then he would have to pay 101 rupees. So that's 1% cess was introduced. The government handed over, all these schools into Indian hands when local self-government was established, district boards and municipalities were established. So from 1885 to 1950, they came to be known as board schools. So from 1950 onwards, they were called as primary and middle schools. And there's an unbroken continuity. If somebody is from a village where the indigenous school existed, and if they have studied in primary school, so there was an unbroken continuity here. So we had a wonderful system of indigenous schools, and it was nurtured by the British. But what went wrong? There are 4 important reasons that, by the end of 19th century, the schools came to be dominated by the upper caste, teachers and students. First was, government was not ready to spend money. The investment, or rather the expenditure of the government on education was 1.5% up to 1870, and it became 1% because series of famines happened in 1870. So with 1%, it was hardly, the schools could not progress. The salary of teacher was 5 rupees in 1840s when they adopted the school, and it continued to be, it was just 10 rupees in 1810. So salaries did not increase. And 1885-87, when they handed over the municipalities, to whom? To the landed gentry. And these were the people who did not want their servants to enter schools. So this was one of the reasons why, the number of lower caste students came down. And the same group was also against the entry of girls into schools. So you find lot of debates and lot of decisions taken by these municipalities. You can go to any archives in India and look at a specific municipality documents, you will find that. And it also led to the check of entry of girls and lower caste into schools. The second was the language policy. Unlike the popular understanding, British were very adamant on mother tongue education. They did not use that word mother tongue, but they said that it's vernacular education. All children should compulsorily study. So from class 1 to class 7, the schools were regional medium, Kannada medium, Tamil medium, Bengali medium, and so on. High schools were Anglo vernacular. English was a medium of instruction, and they also studied one language. But the students coming from the first generation, learners, they could not survive in the high school because no English was taught. Whereas middle class and rich children, they send their children to missionary schools and private schools. So the poor and the lower caste were left out. The third was the payment by result. This was again introduced by the British, mainly because after the incorporation of these indigenous schools, a number of schoolmasters did not improve. They would not teach, geography. They would not teach history. And geography was the main reason, they would not teach. In fact, George Campbell, who was, governor of Bengal, he traveled from Calcutta to Patna, and he entered every school that he came across on the way. And he had one question, where is Bundelkhand? Neither the teacher nor the student could answer this, including Patna school. So even the city school, they could not answer. So finally the British decided that, something should be done, we should induce the teachers, there should be some kind of a reward for the teachers for actually teaching. So they introduced this payment by result. And this was not something that was, they did not, create this system for India. They already had used it in England. From 1855 onwards, they used this payment by result, and accordingly, the teacher would receive the salary at the end of the year, and if all students have passed. So it worked like this. Government gave 6 rupees per child if it passed. And suppose, imagine if there are 30 students and all the 30 students pass, he would get 180 rupees by the end of the year, which was around 15 rupees a month, which was reasonably all right. But if only 15 students pass, his income was lower than that of a Mali, that is gardener of that school. So imagine an illiterate gardener getting more salary than a literate teacher. So this led to 3 important reasons which we suffer even to this day. The teachers encourage first generation learners. This was extensively, this particular system, payment by result, was implemented in Madras Presidency. That is why by the end of 19th century you find large number of upper caste children in schools and teachers also, because they would pass. Only the upper caste children who already had fathers, brothers who would teach them, they would pass. Learning became exam centric, and the system of rote learning started, and this is actually the starting point of rote learning in India. Fear and stress of examination started, a lot of pressure on students to pass rather than enjoy learning. Then the 4th reason was the political leadership. How did the political leadership operate? In 1838-39, we have seen the Bengal data. There were, Chandal and Kaibarta caste, that is Dalit caste teachers and students. 1840, government decides to assist the school. This is Radhakant Deb, who was member of the Viceroy's Executive Council. This is what he says. And interestingly, Radhakant Deb came from a Shudra caste. There is still debate in Bengal. I have spoken to many of the Bengali scholars. They still debate whether he was a Dalit or an OBC. So he also comes from an ambiguous lower caste, and he's a Sanskrit scholar. Radhakant Deb is a Sanskrit scholar. And this is what he says. Education, would wean the youth from the plough, the axe, and the loom, to render them ambitious only for the clerkships. So he vehemently opposes the entry of lower caste children. So in 1870, Britain introduced compulsory education, and Governor General Mayo and Governor Campbell wanted to introduce in India. They did not call it compulsory education, they called it mass education. The entire mass of the country should be literate. Parimala Mukherjee, he says that education should not be given to poor and low caste because educated will not respect the upper caste. And we also find Syed Amir Ali. These two are members of the Viceroy's Executive Council. They are the people who, the most powerful Indians at that point of time. They are sitting every day with the Governor General. And he says that, maktabs are enough for Ajlaf Muslims, that is the lower caste Muslims. And he even questions, in Bhagalpur Jilla School, out of 120 Muslim students, only 9 are from Ashraf caste, the elite Muslims. And why government is wasting money on these students? Actually, there is a letter written by him to the Governor General. So Rajendra Lal Mitra opposes fee concession given to the poor student. He says the government cannot charge unequal amount for the same commodity. Today we talk about commodification of education. Here is an Indian leader who is talking about education as a commodity. He tells the government you can't make unequal charges for the same commodity. So by 1900, schools and colleges came to be filled with affluent upper caste students. The poor and the low caste got further marginalized. They also opposed, the same group, Parimala Mukherjee, Syed Amir Ali, Rajendra Lal Mitra, they oppose, teaching maths, science and girls to schools. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was very illuminating. I have 2 quick questions. One, can you tell us how teachers were picked picked for these indigenous schools? Did they have to go through some kind of training, or how were they allotted? And the second was, how big were these indigenous schools? What was the classroom strength like?
Okay. These schools were not established by anybody. So any literate, educated person would start a school. So it is voluntary. And he would start a school. If he is good teacher, then the students will continue to come. If he is a bad teacher, then the parents would pull the children out, and then he will have to close down the school. So average number of students was anywhere between 8 to 25. And the number of schools with 25, 26 or 40, they were less in number. So majority of school children were anywhere between 8 to 10, 12, 15. That was a number. So, except Gujarat. Gujarat had large schools mainly because teachers used to take more number of students because they had to survive. Because only after a child learns something, then they would get the fee. Yeah.
Hi, so my question is that from the data that you provided, was the division of Indian society in terms of caste not as bad in the pre-British era, and it really peaked in the British era, and now we're like again going down.
Exactly.
So the whole image that the caste system was extremely entrenched in India is kind of like not correct. Do you think that?
See, caste system existed. There is no denying the fact. But caste system did not operate in the field of education. There were Dalit students in Bengal, okay? But I do not know if those Dalit students actually went to a temple, what would happen. I am not sure of what would happen. And secondly, we have to remember, in 18th century, the largest part of Hindus followed Vaishnava tradition. Vaishnava tradition does not acknowledge caste system. Why there were Dalit Sanskrit teachers in Bengal? Mainly because they all were followers of Chaitanya. Okay, so that they very clearly says, when I enumerate the attendance of this, in fact I have even gone through the attendance sheets. They very specifically say Vaishnava. They do not say to which caste they belong to. When the headmaster writes the caste status of each student, they claim to be Vaishnavas. So they say that we are different. So I do not say caste system was not severe, but I only say is that in the field of education, the kind of casteism that we see today, in the post-independent India particularly, was not there. But if these Dalit students and teachers actually went to a temple, I do not have any information what would happen, or whether there would be resistance or that. We know that they sat on separate mats, but except that no other discrimination has been reported.
These numbers are very small when you look at, even in your data,
Huh.
you look at Dalit students or lower
Yeah, they are very
castes,
small. They are very small.
and we are not really seeing it in relation to the rest of the village population of
Yes,
those categories.
No, but
so,
see,
how
the literacy was
indicative.
less than 10%. So the census had not started, around this point of time.
No, but is it enough data there for us to say that there wasn't? That's a big leap to say that there wasn't as much discrimination as there is today. Two Dalit students in a.
Yeah, I understand. But then the number of students in each class is also very different. For example, in Northwestern Province, the average number of students were 10 or 12. So you find one Jat, one Ahir, one Rajput, one Brahmin, one Chamar student in the classroom.
Actually, this is also linked to another question. This is one picture, you're calling it indigenous schools. But there are other kinds of, there is the madrasa, and there are other kinds of schools. So this is not the total picture.
I did not address madrasa mainly because the students and teachers were Muslims. There is no diversity of, the students and teachers. And very specifically, the Islamic knowledge was imparted to them. That's the reason why I did not extensively talk about the Sanskrit schools also. A school teaching Vedas would be teaching Vedas to a Brahmin boys, not even Brahmin, girls. Except Kerala, there are only, 3 Brahmin girls were there. So, see, whatever data that is available, I have made use of it. But many districts, the collectors who collected the data mentioned that there are 500 students, 300 students, they belong to these castes. But how many? I do not know. Yeah.
Well, I get the feeling that very, very sweeping generalizations have been pulled out of the data that you presented.
Yeah.
You looked at 16,000, archives gave you 16,000 schools. And the sourcing appears to be mostly British administrators, right?
Not administrator. William Adam was not an administrator.
Well, British sources.
The British, yeah.
And some biographies or autobiographies of certain people. I don't know what the numbers are. So the data is perhaps of a certain kind, people coming from British sources, let's say, right? Not indigenous sources. So from that alone to say that, the caste system or the Ashraf, Ajlaf divide among the Muslim students, I think aren't we pulling out too much? And even the data that you showed, if there's a certain number of Brahmins in your overall, in the universe, the proportion of Brahmins seems to be unusually high in relation to their total population.
Total population, yes.
So,
Yes.
To say...
I'm not denying that.
No, I know, of course, you can't. But to infer from that a very large number of non-Brahmin teachers as well as students, that seems to be the dominant picture.
Yeah.
But in relation to their, fraction in the population in that village or district or wherever, I don't think that is an extraordinarily high number of, And two, I'm really surprised, leading back to the earlier question, that how come the idea, the British through the land revenue systems created a certain kind of, in the Bengal presidency, other presidencies. So you have more distinct division of a class type coming into the picture, which roughly corresponded with the caste issue also. The people who agreed to become zamindars, who could pay a certain sum of money to the administration in order to earn the contract to be rent collectors, right?
Yeah.
All these are very, very late developments, 18th century
18th
developments,
century, late
right?
18th century.
Right. But before that, whom did the land resource, the main capital asset in the system belong to? And in case the untouchability issue prevailed even then, it's hard to see that today you find these reports of an extreme kind in the newspapers every other day. It's hard to see how a Brahmin teacher or Brahmin boy would be sitting next to leave alone a Dalit boy, but a non-Brahmin kind of student. And a Brahmin boy agreeing to be taught by not even a Dalit boy, but even a non-Brahmin teacher, right? That's one aspect. And two, from my own experience of the northern part of the country, Brahmins in the era that you're talking about and an earlier period, they would be mostly engaged in scriptural learning, right? Not in things like record keeping or issues of that kind. And therefore, it's not a surprise. You mentioned certain castes. That these castes, you find a fair representation both as students and naturally as teachers, because student of today will be teacher tomorrow, right? So that kind of thing. And I think the data that you've got, if we draw only a limited picture that this is what they are saying, but to draw something about, of course you spoke about language policy and various policies being introduced in the 19th century, right? And also your observations that the British did not wish to interfere with the prevailing social systems of the indigenous people. That comes after 1857, not prior.
No, even earlier. Because Ram Mohan Roy had to fight long and hard to get sati abolished.
No, yeah. But sorry, I meant the other way around. That earlier, the British themselves were trying to practice the native way of life, if you like,
Yeah.
living their life of a Nawab
They
or a
wore-
Raja.
They wore pyjamas and they ate Indian food and, they married Indians and, that was there.
Yeah. So, I don't know this, to build such a large house on the basis of this kind of data, I think the inferences being drawn are far too strong than the data would suggest.
Okay.
That's my humble submission to you.
Okay.
Yeah, this is completely out of curiosity. I'm referring to the chart that you presented of the caste and gender of students in Sanskrit schools in Kerala. So, out of curiosity, I want to know, as compared to Vedas, Nyaya, Ayurveda, metaphysics, the Jyotisha had tremendous amount, quite a large number of students, that too coming from different castes.
Yeah.
So, was that a kind of a job guarantee kind of a course during that
This is
time?
exactly the thing. The number of students who actually studied Vedas were very few because you cannot earn anything. Many of the things that I did not speak because of lack of time, I was told 45 minutes, so I tried to prepare the PPT accordingly. The Sanskrit teachers had to teach free of cost. They could not take, any amount of money from anybody also. Okay, so they had to work somewhere else and then also teach because it's completely forbidden for the Sanskrit teacher to take money. Even when the British established Sanskrit schools, they found it very difficult to get Sanskrit teachers to come and teach. However, those who were practicing Ayurveda and Jyotisha could earn money. So that is why you find large number of students going into these schools. Whereas Dharma Shastra, you can't earn a single penny. Vedas, you can't earn a single penny. Okay, so the large number of non-Brahmin students were also going there.
Yeah.
So very few students. Actually, I didn't show you a chart on who studied which discipline in Bengal, and how many students were there in Dharma Shastra, how many were in Jyotisha, how many were in Vaidyas, that is the medicine, Ayurveda. So that is, you can earn money, but in these things you cannot. So very dedicated students alone would go there. And how extremely poor they were, William Adams says there is no difference in the lifestyle between a student who is studying the Vedas or a Chandal student, that is a Dalit student who is going to, the local Bengali schools. So the economic status is same, he says. Thanks. So that was related to income.
Thank you for the session, firstly. My question seems a little silly, but I want to understand from a retrospective point of view, like what we learned, how is it applicable in 21st century, right? So from a Britisher point of view, we kind of have a very a noble lens given to the approach of them establishing schools to us. So from a socio-economic point of view, 18th century, 19th century, what was the objective of introducing education in India from a Britisher's point of view, and how did Indians perceive it at different space?
Okay.
This is my first question.
Okay.
I can go with the next one also. When you said the schools, we have information like different students have different mats. How on the infra front, did they have separate washrooms? Did they share the same water? Any information on that point, or it's the same?
No, we don't have any information. Washroom is out.
Okay.
Because they were conducted in either temples or Chandi Mantaps, and also washrooms are out. And whether they took water from the same we have no information.
Okay.
I wish I had those information.
Yeah.
Okay. Now coming to your first question, because this is an entirely different thing. My book is there, Beyond Macaulay. That's why I have titled. Everyone talks only about Macaulay. Okay, Macaulay came, Macaulay did this and those things. Actually, Macaulay wrote 42 education minutes, not one education minute. Nobody bothers to quote 41 education minutes. So that's besides the point. Why did the British introduce education in India, and what was the Indians' point of view? British did not want to introduce education in India because the rise of British power in India after Battle of Plassey was not a Plassey. It was not a battle. You know, the Nawab's army just moved to the side of the British. It was a Battle of Buxar where the actual battle took place. Okay, the Battle of Buxar and the rise of British power in India and the fall of British power in America, the loss of American colonies were simultaneous events. So they feared, there are a number of letters written by the British officer. If we introduce education in India, Indian students are already brilliant. They will start questioning us and we will lose the empire. So Ellenborough, Governor General Ellenborough says that if we introduce the kind of education that Macaulay, Trevelyan and others want us to introduce, we will not last for 3 months. So this is what his prediction, if English education is introduced. So they completely oppose that. In contrast, all the first 10 institutions they established, they're all Sanskrit schools, Sanskrit colleges and madrasas. In contrast, Indians wanted modern knowledge. So I have actually quoted essays in my book, written by students. They say that our country is so poor, our country, you look at European countries, they are so well advanced, we should get that technology. These are 15, 16-year-old high school students who are writing essays. They say that we should get the technology. How do we build ships? How do we, manufacture printing press? So these are the questions that the Indians were asking. So there are numerous petitions written by Indians. So until the establishment of the universities, 1857-58, majority of modern educational institutions were established by Indians themselves, and some by the missionaries. So the first educational institution was established by Ram Mohan Roy, Vidyalaya, which the British called it as Hindu college because majority of students were Hindus. Okay, so that became Calcutta University. Elphinstone College, don't go by the name. The college was established by the people of Maharashtra. They called it Elphinstone because he was a governor, So this became the heart of Bombay University. So the British did not establish anything until 1851 because 1853 they had to renew the contract. East India Company every 20 years had to renew the contract. They did not establish. They established few high schools. In fact, Macaulay established about 8 high schools across North India, the rural hinterland, Azamgarh, and all these places, But as soon as he left India, he was there only for 3.5 years. As soon as he left, all the schools were closed down. Thomas Munro established 101 schools. But as soon as he died, the schools were shut down. So they had no intention, and one of the important reasons why they opposed was that you must have heard the Age of Reason book, Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. That was a book which influenced American War of Independence as well as French Revolution. Do you know the second largest number of copies where they were sold? They were sold in India. Indians who had learned English through informal, I have an essay on how Indians learned English through informal sources. They would go and talk to a British officer or a British soldier there, and they would request him to teach English and so on and so forth. This is the informal way of learning. And the largest number of copies were sold in India, and they were very scared. They were scared of losing, so there is a direct connection between the geopolitics and the educational this thing. After 1840s, when the revolutionary period in Europe came down, once they were over, then they became little relaxed, and then they would allow the Indians also to establish schools. Until then, none of them.
Because my understanding is in the 19th century, we had First World War, Second World War.
20th century, First World War.
Sorry, so 1940 to 19, yeah, 40. So I think I'm loud enough. Is that okay? Sorry. Yeah. So when they're not interested, why would they invest 1 lakh rupees annually? Why would they want to incentivize things?
Yeah. This is done by a group of Scots. The Scottish members of parliament were the ones who were always raising the issue. What have you done in India? In what way are you educating Indians? You should always see the English and Scots are 2 separate group of people. Okay, so Macaulay was also a Scot. You look at any British officer who has taken any interest in education, they were Scots. Thomas Munro was a Scot. Even Hunter, W.W. Hunter was a Scot. So every bit of education, I have not come across any Englishman so far who has taken any interest in Indian education. Later the liberals, and that is also because the kind of society that England had. Education was limited to only the landed gentry. It was only that group which came to India. So you don't, in archives you hear the voice of poor Scottish officers who came from absolute poverty. You don't hear the voice of the poor Englishman because they came as semi-literate or illiterate soldiers in the army. And you hear only the elites. So the voice of ordinary Englishman is also drowned out here. Yeah. No, they could not control any longer. When the people of Calcutta raise more than 1 lakh was the budget for the entire British India. They raise more than 1 lakh rupees to establish a college, and there are 4 Scots who get involved in it, in establishing the college. The British couldn't stop it. They tried their best, but when I say British, I'm not talking about English and Scot, it's the state, colonial state. But colonial state was controlled by the elite aristocratic Englishmen.
Two thoughts I had, ma'am. The first one is regarding what are the myths that we started out to start looking at what has happened through the data. Apart from the two myths that's broken in the sense of the oral tradition, and apart from that, the other thing that stands, at least from what I could sense from your arguments, is the other part on that there were no Dalit students or only Brahmins were the teachers. Apart from these two, the other two major arguments stands as such is that what is that what we could sense from the from your presentation? That is one. The second one is actually you were pointing out, most of these data sets, as you told, were collected from Scottish officers.
Scottish officers.
So,
there were also a few, like when Thomas Munro asked his officers to collect the data. It is collector and the assistant collector. All assistant collectors were Indians. So it's not that Indian voice is not there. It is there.
No. What I am concerned about is would their interest not be to tell that the British is not doing anything at the first place?
Their intention was to give a data to the government and say, look, these many schools are there. You invest money, that 1 lakh rupees in these schools. So that was their basic intention. Okay. But if there is a collector who is an Englishman, he would, you probably missed out the data on Canara, South Canara, which was part of Madras Presidency. That collector refuses to give the data. He says there are no schools. He is an Englishman. So there is complete blank only for the district.
So that is where I was actually thinking, should we also not see what the data what was the purpose of the data being collected, and see what were the interests involved when the data was so collected, and how can it play out in when we understand it today?
See, I'm not linking today, because as a historian, I limit my study, my analysis to the data that is available. But only thing I like to draw what is happening today. For example, entire South Bihar, not a single Brahmin teacher is there. And all the students are studying under non-Brahmin teachers. Okay. But today you see what has happened. It's completely fractured society, what we have today.
I was also, one last question, I was also thinking, what was the other opportunities that were available back then for the students? Because
for these indigenous students.
Did the Brahmins students move out to any other opportunities like
No. So there are two kinds of jobs which were available for the indigenous school, the students from the indigenous schools. The first one is a local administration. For example, who would a king of Mysore appoint as clerks, as administrators? These are the people who passed out of the indigenous schools. Okay. The second occupation that was open to them, which many followed, was preaching, religious preaching. Many of them were Vaishnavas, so they would go from place to place and then they would recite Bhagavata, which was very interesting text. In fact, many of the North Indian states, where the texts which were taught were Bhagavata. I mean, I said Mahabharata in a very broader sense because Viduraniti was taught in Marathi schools, but also Bhagavata was taught in areas where Vaishnava tradition was very strong. For example, Gujarat. For example, Karnataka. For example, Bengal. Okay, so they would become religious preachers. I mean, not religious preacher per se, but we had somebody by name Bhadragiri Keshav Das, who would go from place to place and do the Harikatha. So, and then there was no caste attached to this. People from any caste could become Haridas. Okay, if you take a look at a number of Vaishnava, I'm not talking about the saints, but the followers of the Vaishnava tradition, whether it is Chaitanya in Bengal or in North India and other places, they came from various castes, so they could become this. So these are the only two occupations that I could find out. If there was a third occupation, I do not know. So when the East India Company is established, when they start administering, they take this whole group of people who would become accountants. That is why this notion of Indians becoming clerks in the administration starts. They were not clerks, they were only accountants, because very sensitive information passes through the hands of clerks. So the clerks were always British. So the accountants were all Indians. Maybe a chief accountant was British, but majority of people in the account section were Indians because they were very good in maths. That's what the records tell us.
How do other vocations like masonry, carpentry, things like that fit into this education system?
There were many students who came from the carpentry caste, Sutar caste, and they probably were not interested in continuing their father's occupation. Probably their brothers were following, and then this one boy is interested, so he would go to the school, he would change his occupation. So, but most of the students were from the poorer background, so you do not find Zamindar's children here. And as you were saying, the kind of people who were revenue collectors, they were earlier revenue collectors under the Mughals. They become the Zamindars because the British do not want to deal with one by one collector, and they say that you give us 3% of your revenue to us, which was also actually a loss. There's a huge debate how the British government lost so much money in Bengal, because 3% remained continuous throughout 190 years of British administration. Not 190s, it was 1790s it was introduced, and for the rest of the British administration it was only 3%. So the Zamindars were already there, the tax collectors were already there. So once the British administration was established, they co-opted them. For example, Deshpandes, Kulkarnis, they all are, the occupations, but they became Kulkarnis under the British, they became Deshpandes, they became Deshmukhs became there, Jagirdars continued. So there was no complete changeover of the society.
One last question.
Yeah. You'd mentioned that there were different stages at which the students learned. The bright students 4 years, then 6 years, and 8 years. Do we have any observations of how the teacher would be managing the different levels of learning, especially if you have a batch of 25 or 50 students?
I have no idea. But some of the British officers who tried to introduce the monitorial system, it is said that monitorial system emerged in India. No, it was not. And actually some of the British conservative officers particularly, they try to introduce this monitorial system so that it keeps the competency of students low. But then there is a resistance from the teachers. So We do not know the actual classroom. Sanskrit schools actual classroom teaching I have, because William Adam actually went there. He conversed with them in Sanskrit, and the Sanskrit teachers continued to write to him, letters even after the survey was over. So that thing we have. But then here it was like a regular class. That's what they say. They say that it is like a regular class. How did he manage students, the basic students who are learning alphabet, to the students who are, for example, mastering Shabdamani Darpana or Bharateshu Vaibhava or one of those texts? I really do not know. How did he manage? He must have managed efficiently. That's what my guesswork is. Because there is a lot of praise, not from one British officer, from all the officers who collected the data. They have high praise for Indian teachers.
And with that, we'll come to an end of this session. Thank you, Parimala, for sharing this research and your insights with us today.
Thank you very much.